Hello everyone, this is Michael Stephen Vargas from WeGoChess.com. So, if you don't know already, chess has actually different stages at different parts of the game. And each of these stages have their own descriptions, objectives, and classification. Having the knowledge in each of these phases will allow you to identify how to properly approach them. So it is quite important. And that is the topic of this video, is I'm going to discuss all the three phases of a chess game and maybe just give you the right, let's say, skill in having to identify them in order for you to approach them your own way. So, the very first phase of chess is what's called an opening phase. It is really difficult to pinpoint when exactly does the opening end and when does the next stage begins. But it is typically, if you are just a decent player, it is typically around the first 10 to 20 moves of the chess from its starting position. If you are a beginner, the opening might be 1 to 10 moves from the starting position. The opening actually differs. How long the opening will last differs to what is the skill level of the player. Professionals can actually have 30 up to 30 moves within still their opening preparation. The most prevalent characteristic of the opening phase, which is at the start of the game, is opening theories. Theories are preoccupied or predefined set of moves at the beginning of the game that would allow particular color to play well and maximize their advantages that could lead to conversion. Typically in the opening phase, where it is just right about the starting position, the objectives are developing your piece, getting usually your knight and the bishop, castling early to keep the king safe, and pushing your pawns near the center in order to maximize the space that could be occupied by those pawns, and just making the middle game much easier, because when you have pawns advanced right at the opening, you will have much more space to work with at the middle game, which is the next stage that I will discuss later. In this phase, which is the opening, moving the same pawn or piece are actually much more rare, because the goal is to develop, and in order to develop more pawns or pieces, it is recommended to move different set of pawns or pieces at different times in order for you to at least develop a pawn or piece every move at the start of the game, which is the opening phase. The ideas usually in the opening are much more simple, although traps do exist which require some complication, but since the pieces are not as developed yet as in the middle game, it's not as concrete. The attacks aren't that sophisticated just as yet, although they can be, but usually it's all just developing and controlling important squares, unlike the middle game. Due to this simplicity, the opening is actually treated as much more something that doesn't need a lot of thinking. So if you watch a lot of chess games, most openings are played almost instantaneously, not only because there's theory involved, which is also a reason, but also because there's not a lot of consideration yet. There's only a limited moves that actually make sense. Next is the middle game. So after the opening, there's the middle game, and the middle game is characterized by having as much pieces and pawns already developed. So this is where attacks, planning, defense, tactics, even strategy thrives, because unlike the opening where the pieces are not as developed, in the middle game where it is developed, there's actually some fun things you could do with your pieces, and the options actually expands. Now there's attacks are much reasonable, defense are much more reasonable. This is also the phase where the kings are usually castled already and have a safe space, unlike in the opening. A game can be considered to have entered the middle game even if maybe one player or one pieces has underdeveloped piece yet, as long as the majority of the pieces or pawns are developed, even though not every one of them has been developed, not necessarily. So that's not necessary. There should be one or two, three pawns or pieces that are not developed at this phase, even at the middle game. But if you're viewing the entire picture, there's just much more options, and they at least the pieces are doing something or having a role, rather than the opening where the pawns and pieces are much likely not doing anything at all. Also, unlike the opening, in the middle game, it is less likely to be memorized. This is why it's usually harder to teach a middle game, because unlike in the opening where you could actually just teach the moves, in the middle game you need to teach that strategy, not the actual moves, because middle game is much more complicated than the opening, because there are so many sorts of middle game, where in the opening you would actually chart it from the beginning. With the middle game, it's much harder to identify, because after the first move has been played, the first moves have been played, there's just so much more possibility. So memorization is kinda taking the back seat at this phase. Usually, this is the phase where you can be as creative than any other phase out there, because it's just so unpredictable. Unlike the end game or the opening, where you could actually study some practical positions, in middle game you could also study practical positions but are not necessarily applicable to you. It is usually the longest of all the phases, and usually not all the time, and also usually the most complex, because so many pieces are active, so many pieces are available, unlike the end game, which I will discuss later, and so many things can happen: attack, defense, and planning. Although you could argue that the end game could last long if one side is really that stubborn, for the most or majority of the cases, the middle game just take longer. In fact, in lower rated competitions, some do not even reach the end game and will already be concluded in the middle game. So that tells you something of how long middle games actually are. Next, or lastly, is the end game, which is characterized by having only a few pawns and pieces left in the game. Although some players just define an end game when queens are exchanged, or the game shifted from being attack and defense to who can, for example, push the pawns the fastest, which is also the characteristic of the end game, which is the pawns now have the power to has much more likelihood of being promoted. Usually in this phase, the pawns are being defended, pushed, and it has actually a key role in bringing a win. Typically, you can identify an endgame when there are only about 3 pieces left. So for example, a queen, rook, and bishop for each side. Then some would classify that already as an endgame, but I do believe that maybe 2 pieces left, for example, a queen and a knight, then maybe that is still a borderline endgame. But the point is, when there's not a lot of pawn and pieces left, then it must be an endgame, although there's not an exact metric to this. This is also the phase where the accountability shoots through the roof, because mistakes have deeper consequences. So if you make a mistake in the opening, you could make up for it in the middle game and end game. If you make a mistake in the middle game, you can make up for it in the end game. If you make a mistake in the end game, the game will just end. And so the accountability is much higher in this phase, because it is the final stage of the game. Also, there's 2 pieces that actually becomes powerful, except adding to the pawns. So pawns are not pieces, but there are also 2 pieces that becomes the highlights of the endgame, which is the rook and the king. So the rook usually does not play an important role, although can be in the middle game, because there's so much pieces for the rook to actively impose its influence. Same with the king. The king in the middle game needs to stay safe, because there's so much pieces that could threaten the king. However, when endgame comes, the king is much more likely to be taken advantage of, and therefore could actually help escort the promotion of the pawns. And of course, the pawns are much more powerful because there are less pieces to actually stop promotion. Um, in fact, the king actually is one of the most critical piece of the endgame. Also, the rook, because at this phase, since there's no more pieces to actually block the rook, the rook can pretty much go in and out from the board from side to side at this particular phase. At this phase of the game, memorization can actually be applied, although not to the same extent in the opening, for example. So in the end game, there's what we call theoretical endings, like for example, rook per rook endgame, or maybe some oppositional endgame that you could actually memorize. But it is not still to the same extent as the openings because you have to actually reach those specific positions first by playing on your own, unlike in the opening where you could play the moves immediately right off the bat. Of course, the end game ends when the game has already concluded. So for example, one side already won through a checkmate, resignation, or maybe it has become a draw through insufficient material or agreement by a draw. So when there's not a lot of pieces yet, usually when there's only 3 or 2 pieces left, then endgame starts and it will only ever end, just as the name implies, endgame, at the end of the game. So there are these 3 phases in chess is actually pretty interesting if you think about it. They have different, very contrasting characteristics, contrasting objectives, but with the same goal of winning material, positional advantage, and checkmating the white king. So I would advise that it's important for you to identify this, so you could also learn at different phases, but don't overthink about this. Just play because they may have different characteristics, but usually the goal is still the same, which is to try to checkmate the white king. But learning the description and the characteristic can still help you to identify what you should prioritize depending on what part of the game you are participating in. So that is all. If you like this video, you can give it a like so it could be recommended for more people. And that is all. Sleep well and play